another exciting moment for us to be together, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another edition of Global Insight on For You Media Africa. Today we are talking something very optimal and of course looking at Africa and its strategic mineral and the problematic of course centers on the implications of West race for critical minerals in Africa. We're looking at the implication in Africa and beyond. And the question is, where can we place Africa's resource nationalism? Today's program with a panel of experts, we're going to dive into a profound impact of Africa's critical minerals and, of course, looking at regional security, economic development, and the important role in supporting global industries. These minerals, which are essential according to reports for high-tech sectors like defense, clean energy, and telecommunications, have highlighted or heightened strategic significance in an increasingly interconnected world. And recently, the United States has been warned or cautioned to diversify its resource sources to be able to meet up with future needs, and a quote, to counter China's head start in Africa, Washington must roll out more vigorous commercial diplomacy with a keen eye towards building a critical minerals partnership in Africa. A 76-page report said, which was released by the United States Institute of Peace. The report also underlined that an option for the U.S. would be to increase commercial diplomacy in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which happens to be the world's number one cobalt supply, and the Southern African nation of Gambia that stands as Africa's second largest copper producer. So in the course of this program, we want to look at these move by the U.S. and other countries that are actually vying for resources or resource base in Africa. How will this benefit the African continent? And of course, we want to see the implications not just in Africa, but beyond. And we are also going to analyze some components that make up this very important topic for today. It's Global Insider. Time for us to uncover the panel of experts, and I'll be taking you to Moscow. We're being joined by YULIA BERG. She's a political scientist, founder GLOBus Expert Club. Hello to you, Yulia. A pleasure having you this day.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. Happy to join you today.
It's always a pleasure having you to share insight on pertinent issues like this one. Let's say hi to and welcome HARLEY SCHLANGER, who is the international spokesperson of SCHILLER Institute. Hello to you, dear HARLEY, and welcome again to the Pan African TV.
Well, hello, thanks for your invitation. And I have to say, this is an absolutely timely moment for this discussion, given the situation in the world, the chaos that's been unleashed by the Ukraine war, by the Israeli genocide in Gaza. It's absolutely important to be discussing how we get out of this mess, and it means getting out of the control of the unipolar order.
Thank you so much, and of course we appreciate your time to contributing to this very important topic. Indeed, it is a new world order. Let's go now to Canada, joined by Dr. Elijah Enaku, who is the director of the Center for Africa Development. Welcome to the program, Dr. Enaku.
Thank you, Clarice. It's been a while, and good to be on the program again after a while. So thanks for having me on this program. It's a timely time. It's the right moment to talk about things like this. Africa is going through a transformation, and there are critical issues that we need to talk about. So thanks for having me one more time, Clarice.
And welcome back to you, Dr. Enaku. I will kick off this interesting moment with your interesting program with you, Dr. Enaku. We are looking at the West's race for critical minerals in Africa, and particularly what caught our attention is the latest news where the United States Institute of Peace has cautioned the government to look elsewhere, like particularly in Africa, for mineral resources in such a way that it will not be stranded when if things get sour with the People's Republic of China, and they identified the African continent as that very fertile ground for the raw materials that could help the United States boost certain elements in its country. So we want to analyze holistically this very strategic point, and what do you think this means for Africa at a moment of heightened geopolitical competition across the continent?
Well, Clarice, thanks for giving me the microphone first. But what I want to say is, I want to start on a very cautionary note. This is an opportunity for Africa. At the same time, it's a risk. Because if you read that report, when you sent your invitation to me and you told me that's what you're going to be talking about, I had a look at that report. And if you look at that report, it's a strategic think tank caution for the United States on what they think the goal and the intention should be in terms of acquiring resources that are going to power the next generation of technology, security, the economy, and all whatnot. Mm-hmm. There's no problem with that. It is every country has those strategic plans, 5-year terms, 10-year term, 5-year, 8-year term, and so on, which they plan on where they want to go. But here is where I think had come in, and this is where every African out there has to be listening to this. Africa has always been talked about like a paradox, the mineral curse. Those are the terms that we hear when it comes to Africa and minerals. And you ask yourself, why do we find countries that are imbued and endowed with all these resources being at the lower echelon of the development spectrum? That's a question we need to ask ourselves. Is it because the Western powers like the United States, Canada, Russia, and the rest of the world are coming in and taking these resources and going away and leaving Africa undeveloped? Or is it because Africa is not yet ready to play on the global scene in terms of what they possess? So this is where the discussion needs to go. And first and foremost, I want to say here that Africa, when it comes to minerals, it's endowed in such a way that African economy can either benefit or it become a curse. Let me explain what I mean by that. Because when you have these resources and you look at the American strategy, you look at European strategy, you look at Russian strategy, you look at even China, because as we speak like this, China is coming in very great number to exploit resources, even though we have minerals, a lot of minerals in China, but they are coming to Africa. So when you look at all these countries coming in, asking yourself, what strategy does African countries, because this is where I want to lay my emphasis.
Absolutely.
I want to lay my emphasis on African countries. These resources on the African soil, these resources are owned by Africans. These resources are for Africans, for African development. These countries, when they come in, how are these resources exploited? Number one, the danger we find here, Clarice and gentlemen and the lady in the studio is that these resources are exploited sometimes in a way that the economies of these countries become single-handedly dependent on these resources. And when you have an economy that is single-handedly depending on the extraction of a particular resource, the economy of that country is now exposed to fluctuations in the commodity market. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that there are vulnerabilities in the economy, and that's what we're finding. Whether you're talking about mineral, you're talking about oil and gas, we find that African economies, when they are doing their budgeting or whatnot, and they're working with these Western powers, there is no intention, I put it in quotes, intentions from the parts of the Western world to help the African economies diversify. Because when you diversify, that's where you move the economy away from the vulnerabilities that the economy is going to face because of commodity fluctuation in the market. That's a danger that African economies are facing. So when we have the United States, we have Russia, we have China, we have all these countries coming in. My goal at the center that we work with a lot of our partners is to push for these countries to make sure that they are highlighting the danger of these countries solely depending on these resources to fund the economy. They must be pushing them for diversification. When you read the report of the United States Security think tank, they did identify good governance because they found out that in exploitation of these resources, a lot of it end up in the hands of gangs and mismanagement or what. They did identify that. But then, if you look at the continent of Africa, when you have identified the problem, what are the resources that you've put in place to see that that problem is solved? Look at Congo that you just mentioned. That is like the breadbasket of mineral resources and extraction all over the world. The worst conflict in the world, in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where the extraction of these minerals is going on.
Yeah,
Why can't the United States?
The introductory statement, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't get you, Clarice.
I say you should be rounding off already for the first intervention, so we can also.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So let me just round up. So if you look at these conflicts that are happening in Africa, for example, you'll find out that a lot of these conflicts are happening in these mineral resource areas or countries. So the Western powers should be able to help Africa when they are coming to exploit these resources so that the benefit of those resources accrue to the economy in which they want to work. I'll give you the microphone, but I'll come back to expand on this point that I'm trying to talk about.
Absolutely, Dr. Enaku. It's about how the African government or African countries that actually have these minerals define the strategies or their mining policies that will ensure that whatever deal that they enter with other or potential investors should benefit both nations or continents. To you, Harley SCHLANGER, we are looking at the quest for strategic mineral resources as well as, the demand has increased and countries are trying to extend to other areas in order to meet the needs of the citizens. And today's topic is capitalized on the recent report from the USA sending the US to Africa to be very categorical, precisely in the Congo and Zambia. So the question is, what do you think can occupy this commercial diplomacy that is enforcing itself in today's multipolar world, like you highlighted already in your preamble?
Well, first of all, Clarice, thank you for inviting me. And I want to say that I very much appreciate the remarks of Dr. Elijah. I want to build on this from a slightly different standpoint by giving a history of why there has to be a new era and why the present era of U.S. unipolar hegemony has to end, and in fact is ending. As President Putin has said, it's the development of a new system is unstoppable. But the question is, how much damage will be done if we don't move this quickly and peacefully from the idea of a so-called rules-based order, which is a fake concept? So I want to just give a very quick history, which goes back to the fact that after World War II, Africa's raw materials were still seen as owned by European colonial powers. And it was a long fight to overcome direct European colonial control. And there are many people who are coming to adulthood in Africa today who did not experience that. But it was quite an extraordinary battle to free Africa from European colonialism. Now, after World War II, there was an effort to bring the United States in because the British were no longer strong enough to bring the United States in as a military enforcer of this imperial order. But there was a fight in the United States. Eisenhower sometimes was with the British, sometimes he wasn't, as in the Suez Crisis in '56. John Kennedy had an early history as being opposed to colonialism, in particular in Vietnam and in Algeria. But with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, we had a whole new era in the United States, which became one of what are, in a sense, colonial wars, controlling raw materials by overthrowing governments, by coups, by clearing out people like Lumumba in the Congo, by running coups in one country after another. And after the economic collapse in 1971 and the removal of the dollar from the gold reserve, the goal of the U.S. and the International Monetary Fund was to indebt every African country as much as possible and to use the conditionalities of the International Monetary Fund to say, as Dr. Elijah was saying, the markets will be set outside of Africa. It will be the European colonials who will determine the price and the value and will dictate the terms of your involvement in the international monetary sphere. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, actually, let me just say, this was combined with Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski with a military imperial doctrine against any nation asserting its sovereignty. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the coming into power in the United States of the Wolfowitz, Bush, Cheney, and later Obama and Biden crowd, they essentially reasserted the imperial right, what is called by Blinken and Biden the so-called rules-based order, where the rules are made in London and Washington, including rules of terms of trade, currency, devaluations, and so on. Now, what has changed is that we're seeing a new spirit, which goes back to the 1956-57 Bandung spirit of the non-aligned nations. And it's becoming contagious. We just saw the announcement today that more French are being kicked out of, I believe it was Mali, the reassertion in Niger and in other countries in West Africa against French colonialism. And maybe that explains why Macron wants to send the French Foreign Legion into Ukraine, because they're no longer welcome in Africa. But neither should the US or British forces. And what we're seeing now with the emergence of the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa alliance, which is now expanding into Africa with Ethiopia and Egypt, and has a potential for taking the world out of the petrodollar control of the London and Wall Street banks, what Dr. Elijah was talking about can be realized. Raw materials in African countries are the sovereign right for the nations of those countries to develop for the benefit of their people, which means industrial capacity, which means energy independence, which means infrastructure development. And I would argue that any country that wishes to make a claim on resources in Africa should look at what's happening now with the so-called rules-based order committing genocide against the Palestinians. We need a movement which actually defends the sovereignty of every nation and which the sovereign right of governments to act on behalf of their people, not on foreign corporations. Now, will the corporations give that up? Well, they control most of the political leaders in Europe and the United States. And so I would say that in terms of Africa, the emergence of sovereign nations, the role, for example, South Africa is playing at the International Court of Justice is crucially important. We need the reassertion of sovereignty, and we need a movement in the West to take power away from these corporate swindlers who insist that African resources are the resources of American and European corporations.
Indeed, there is always a question asked if the fact that Africa has many resources is a blessing or a curse for the continent. And I think it is high time we answer strategically the question. Continuing with you, Yulia, question or the problematic focuses on the implications. And when we're talking about the implications of this quest for strategic minerals in Africa and beyond, we want to look at the strategic implications. You know, this is coming at a time the government of Nigeria has been on shell to ensure that they do a thorough cleanup in the Niger Delta. We can talking about the contamination of waters and the environment and the impoverishment of even the population in the Niger Delta. Yet oil is being exploited from the region. Now we are in an era of even greater stakes. We mentioned already that it is an open commercial diplomacy as far as the place of these strategic minerals are concerned in today's world. So, in your own opinion, dear Yulia, what do you think are those strategic implications that we need to look as far as the strategic minerals are concerned, particularly cobalt, which the report highlights it that it can be used to produce batteries for electronic vehicles, and you can name the rest.
Well, it's not a secret to anyone. I believe that to a large extent, the wealth and the GDP of the Western countries, especially European ones and also the United States, is based on the cheap resources they were able to extract from the African continent. So this taken out of the equation would make them lose much of their production in the first place and much of their business. And unfortunately, not just the environmental regulations to a great extent were not followed, but also the labor regulations and the conditions under which people do get involved into mining sometimes go as far as slavery and the use of child labor in order to extract those rare earth metals, in order to extract gems and gold and many other things. But when we talk about strategic resources, another important one I believe to mention is uranium. Because uranium is essential for nuclear plants and many other things, but especially nuclear plants. And we see that France, at the moment, losing access to uranium at the, let's say, terms and conditions that were extremely favorable for them, and that were underestimating the, the processes and the work of local labor. So they might be losing one of the biggest industries that they were, let's say, not just famous for, but also the one they were making quite a lot of money on, which is nuclear plants, right? Sure. So this is a very important thing to mention over here, I believe. And when we talk about the way the strategic resources were being extracted and the, let's say, infrastructure organized around it, and the general terms and conditions and the level of, let's say, development of that business. And when we look at the African continent, we will see a lot of differences. And I mean, there is a huge gap between the way it was done in the countries that used to be French colonies, mostly in Western and Central Africa, and the ex-British colonies in the south of the continent, right? Sure. Because even looking at simple indicators and simple things such as road and railroad infrastructure, we will see that in the south, they tend to look more like networks connecting different cities and ensuring internal trade. When we look at the map of railroads, which is, speaking louder than words in this case, we will see that most of them would just go from mining regions directly to the port. So even this shows the quite cynical approach that was being used. And another big difference, I believe, is that even at the moment, the struggle for those resources in some countries means a physical struggle, which is, there has to be armed security in order to protect those. And in other countries, mostly in the countries of the south of the continent, even if the property rights migrate from one person to another, if there are some disputes, they are mostly solved using legal instruments and legislative regulations. So there is quite a lot of difference. I think we should divide different things, and we should distinguish what different owners, let's say, the ones that were enjoying all of the benefits of having colonies, the different approaches that they would use, and the different type of investment they would make. So there is a huge difference to take a look at.
Okay, indeed, many stakes to understand as far as this is concerned. Coming back to you, Dr. Enaku, while talking earlier on, you highlighted, of course, many aspects, and even HARLEY and YULIA shared the same perspective, looking at how multinational organizations or even big powers or so-called superpowers impose conditions which are not favorable for countries, and in turn take their mineral resources, the IMF loaning out money and dictating how the money is supposed to be used, maybe constructing roads that leading to the resource base. So the question is, with all of these and with the renaissance across the continent, we already saw Niger taking the move by trying to redefine the policies or strategic policies linking the country and former colonial master France. So the question is, where can we place Africa's resource nationalism, and how can the continent capitalize on this global competition for resources in Africa to benefit itself?
Okay, Clarice. Permit me come back to the point I was trying to make, and also.
Please, can you unmute yourself, Doctor? Your mic, sorry.
Yeah, my mic is not muted. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now. Please.
Okay, I said permit me just highlight the point that I was trying to make before, and also mention a few points that Yulia and Haley also mentioned, which were very valid points. But gentlemen and the lady, I want to just highlight a few things here. When it comes to Africa, what I don't want Africa to do is to replace Peter with Paul. Africa need to understand where they're going. Because as we speak today we're talking about the United States. For example, we're talking about their strategy and all what they've been doing in all the atrocities, and the Europeans, all the atrocities. All that is well documented. We all know about that. But today, as we speak, if you look at FDI, that's a foreign direct investment in Africa, the highest foreign direct investor in Africa is not the United States, it's not Russia, it's not Europeans. China, as we speak. So the question you ask yourself is, you take a step back, what is the African strategy when it comes to dealing with China? Are they going to make the same mistakes that they made when they were dealing with the United States and the Europeans? Or do they have a coordinated strategy when it comes to minerals extractions in the continent of Africa? That is where I think the problem is. Because I don't think any of these countries has gone ahead to say you must negotiate with them. For example, we talked about Niger a while ago. Niger was selling uranium to France at, if I remember the last time I read that report, at 8 euros per kilogram. Meanwhile, we know that in the world market, uranium was being sold at $89.5 per kilogram. How did they come about this strategy with the French? Now that they are actually distracting or kind of disconnecting themselves from the French, what is the new Niger strategy when it comes to uranium extraction? What about looking at policies that are going to make sure that they can also be energy efficient. You find a country that is extracting uranium where 33% of French electricity comes from nuclear power, but this country is living in the dark. Why can there be a strategy where the same country that is, has the uranium, they are able to develop a nuclear energy strategy? Why can't that be a strategy? That's where I'm focusing. That's where I see the problem going. Number two, you mentioned on the show that you mentioned Zambia, for example. Yeah. Zambia is a high producer of copper. Now, what's happening in Zambia? If you look at the economy of Zambia, if you look at the kwacha has highly appreciated, even against the dollar, against the euro, against the rand, against any other currency. What that means is any other sector of the Zambian economy is going to be neglected. There's no agriculture. You're going to find out that the infrastructure is poor. You're going to find all the other sectors in the Zambian economy have been neglected because everybody is now focused on the production of copper. And the currency has appreciated and completely decimated the other sectors of the economy. Those are the strategies that African economists need to be looking at and making sure that in the extraction of all these, we have a global strategy that says, for example, I want to give an example. It might be a bad example, but it's an example that makes sense in terms of what we're discussing. Mm-hmm. When the Germans, I know my colleague Haley might not like to hear about the Germans, but permit me use the Germans. When the Germans colonized Africa, all colonizers were bad. That's why I said it's a bad example. But if you look at the countries that the Germans colonized, if you look at the infrastructure that was left behind, what are you talking about? Any country, name any country in Africa. You go there today, you still see concrete infrastructure that was left behind. Absolutely. That is being utilized even by present government. You're in Cameroon, Cyrus, and you can testify to what I'm saying. That is the strategy I'm talking about. You are extracting, and there is no concrete infrastructure, economy, technology transfer, system organization, nothing in place that says when we extract these minerals, the economies of this country need to benefit in A, B, and C. So that is where Africa is falling short. Because if you look at, for example, I know my friends here from Russia. I love Russia. I've been in Russia. I was a representative of the BRICS Forum. As Yulia, you would know, I was one of the representatives, so I have nothing against Russia. But if you look, for example, Russia, for instance, Russia is very good in agriculture. And Russia is now having a foothold in Africa. I would expect the African countries to say, okay, Russia is very good in agriculture. The agricultural sector is well developed. Let us ask Russians, as we're working together with them, that there should be some sort of a transfer of agricultural technology from Russia to Africa as we're dealing with Russia. That should be the strategy. Because as long as the strategy is not diversification of the economy and you're focused on just extraction of a mineral, Africa will still be very dependent. And number two, permit me, I know that you need to pass the microphone to the next colleague, but if you look at the strategy of Africa, for example, when it comes to the African Union, there is what we call the commodity strategy that was developed by the African Union. As long as that development commodity strategy has not yet been developed, which is a strategy that says that there's going to be a council of African leaders that would develop a strategy that any country that is going to extract minerals in Africa will have to go through the re-harmonization and verification of their status and so on and so forth before they can have a foothold in Africa. Because as I was mentioning before, if you look at the countries where we have rare minerals, I'm talking about the Congo, because that's the basin. That's where more than 80% of the minerals in Africa is coming from. We know Zambia and a few other countries, but Congo is where the deal is. Sure. Look at the war that is going on in Congo. Ask yourself the question, who is sponsoring those wars? Who is sponsoring those wars? You have rebel leaders that have helicopters, machine guns, and all whatnot. Who is sponsoring them? Of course, it's not Africans. Are Westerners who are coming in because they want to extract minerals. They give guns to nationals and they brainwash them to kill ourselves and so on. And then these minerals are extracted. But if you have a commodity strategy in Africa, this will end because before they come in, we know who is coming in. We know who is extracting. We know everything before they even put shovels on the ground. That is the strategy that African countries need to follow. So my intention in this discussion is to make sure that African leaders take the bull by the horns and take their own leadership into hand. It is true that these Western
Absolutely,
oligarchs
yeah,
and the
Doctor.
Western complex, they're coming in and all whatnot. But if you stand your ground, like we're saying in Mali, Burkina Faso, and these other countries, they will bow. They will bow. So that's where I want African countries to go.
Indeed, it's about the strategy and how feasible it is faced with present day global shift. You talked about the crisis befalling countries that are very rich in these natural resources, and we see that some of the countries that fall in under the collective West actually have a foreign policy that favors war. And like you underlined, Dr. Enaku, when there is war, a lot is happening. And as far as the mineral strategy or policy as are concerned, coming again to you, Harley Schrenger, we are looking at the fertile nature of the African continent. You highlighted, of course, very pertinent on the aspect of seeing that it's a high time to put an end to a unipolar world order, and of course some policies that favor just one entity. Now, in this, let me call it in a dynamic landscape of resource competition across the global world, there is need to diversify partnerships in mineral sector to actually reduce dependence on a single global power. In your own perspective, what do you think are those parameters that these countries that are endowed with these natural resources that the world need in order to provide energy to meet up with the changing times? Actually, what are the parameters feasible in the world of multipolarity?
Well, that's a good question. And I think I can build on a little bit of what Dr. Elijah was just saying by going back to the topic of this meeting. You know, the Institute of Peace report. Now, that's not an institute of peace. It's an institute of imperial suppression. The idea that you have to compete with China for Africa's raw materials so that the United States can get its share defines the problem. That's what the unipolar order is all about, using regime change, assassination, coups, terrorism. You know, it's interesting. I think the United States has military units in virtually every part of Africa. What we saw, and I go back to this, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, kicking the French out is the first step toward achieving a modern sovereign state in Africa. You look at the role of divide and conquer that's played. We look at what's going on now in Somalia, in Sudan, the deployment of military forces to do what? To keep the looting in the hands of local people? That's not a solution. So I think what we're seeing now on this idea of multipolarity is a break from the technological apartheid that says that the West has the rights to the resources because the West, and by West I mean the US and Europe, has the technological capacity to use them. And what the African countries should do is try and figure out how to make a little bit of money on the side. That's wrong. And I should just remind people, I'm not German, I'm an American. And I'm very ashamed of what my government has been doing the last 30 years. But I point to the anti-colonial tradition of the United States. The US became an industrial power because it fought against British imperial policy every step of the way in the 19th century and through the first part of the 20th century. The tragedy is that the US succumbed to that imperial outlook and started assuming that because of the military strength and the so-called monetary control, the US has the right to the resources. No American corporation or British corporation or Dutch corporation has the right to the resources of any African nation. Those are the sovereign territory of those countries. Now, the purpose of the Schiller Institute is to build an awareness in the West that the West is going to become irrelevant because Africa is a growing continent in terms of population, in terms of capabilities, in terms of the idea that it's not going to be subordinate to the corporate cartels anymore. And so if the West wishes to have any role in Africa, the idea of technology transfer, education, these are the things that should be provided, healthcare, but mineral extraction, that era is over. It has to be over. Otherwise, we're going to see a competition which is going to end up with a third world war.
Thank you for that, Harley. Yulia, we know that the United States is almost 100% reliant on foreign entities for the resources that the country needs in pushing for the process of industrialization and even the energy and other technological needs of the nation. And we are just in line with what Dr. Elijah Enaku highlighted. It's an era of great competition for resources. I will accentuate on the term commercial diplomacy. What do you think now these with the plurality of countries, global countries, reaching out to Africa for new deals and partnerships regarding mineral exploration and exploitation? You know, when you look at it critically, only the primary stage, which is the extraction stage, is very buoyant, but when you look at other states, it's still very questionable. We want to bring now to the understanding the place of new partners in Africa, particularly the Russian Federation and even other BRICS nations, as far as this commercial diplomacy is concerned, changing the narratives, making sure that these countries like the Eastern Democratic Republic, we can put an end to the war and see total development that will be boosted by the endowment of the region in the terms of the natural resources, and also see that Mali and the Central African Republic, actually the level of development transcends to the capability or the mineral strengths of these countries.
Well, when we talk about the Russia's approach or China's approach, they're quite different from each other in the first place, and from the approach that was being used by the West. So Russia also has all the necessary mineral resources. There can be a lot of debates about the differences or the quality of oil and whatsoever else. Yet at the same time, in Russia, you can find pretty much everything, including diamonds, including gold, and almost all of the elements, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, not all of it is explored at the moment. Not all of it is being extracted, and most of it lies in Siberia. Siberia is a very cold region, so even mining over there is very difficult in terms of the equipment that is supposed to be used there, as the temperature goes as low as 40 degrees below zero. So what does it mean? It means that, number one, Russia has its own resources that are much easier to explore and to mine in terms of legislation, in terms of using your own minerals, when you don't have to, get into any kind of even negotiations about it. You just go and do the exploration and mine, and that's it, right?
Sure.
So there is also quite a lot of offshore resources and Arctic resources that are not even well explored at the moment. So, Russian geologists and mining companies do have a lot to get done in the country in the first place. So for that reason, Russia does not have any kind of aggressive or expansionist policy in terms of Africa. Yet at the same time, it does have the technologies and necessary experience that would allow for mining even in much more difficult circumstances, which is, for instance, 40 degrees below zero, because when it's too hot, you don't have water freezing up, and when it's too hot, you don't have earth freezing up, right? So it makes it, in any case, it makes it much easier to deal with high temperatures rather than low temperatures. So that means that Russia is mostly interested in exporting its technologies. It happily gets involved, or Russian state-owned, and not just state-owned, but private corporations and companies, they happily get involved into the project phase. They're happy to provide opportunities for education in relevant professions, right? And yes, basically, the best, I would say, or the optimal cooperation point here is establishing joint ventures that would allow for ownership that is split between the two parties, the Russian party and the African party, and that would allow not just to mine the resources, but also to manufacture products on site, and then to sell products with the added value.
Yeah.
And that brings much more benefits to the economy. So if we're talking about metals, those could be products made of metals. If you talk about gold, that could be not just ore that's being sold, but that could be, items already made of it, or gold prepared for use in for technical reasons, or for let's say production of electronics and other kinds of devices. So that's the difference. When we talk about China has also quite a different approach, because they are in need of mineral resources that they don't have.
Sure.
But their approach is that they're not interested in creation of joint ventures. They're more interested in taking the ore itself to China, processing it there, and manufacturing there. So using their own labor force. So that's also quite different. Yet at the same time, they're ready to invest much more funds into that, and they are ready to invest into relevant infrastructure. So they do have that kind of resources that Russia does not have. I mean, you can just compare the economies and consider the fact that Russia is a country at war at the moment. So, of course, here, Africa and African countries are able to choose and decide, and to have quite a good negotiating position, because everyone is interested in Africa, but Africa can decide on its own who is she interested in.
And that is where the problematic lies. High multilateralism across the African continent. Our leaders conversant that it is a perfect moment, to be very united in discussing stakes that concerns the African continent, particularly on decisions that will have to do with the mineral endowment of the continent. Let me proceed with you, SCHLANGER. We have identified all of these different approaches taken by different global countries, actually seeing Africa as the hub for mineral resources. So in what ways can this global cooperation and multilateral agreements contribute to ensuring fair and ethical trade practices in the mining, and particularly the extraction of critical minerals from Africa?
Well, unfortunately, I'm skeptical that any European or U.S. interest would be involved in fair policies right now, because the financial crises in the West are causing them to try to loot more aggressively. And that's why we see some of these wars, the colonial wars that are being launched, the use of terrorism and so on, the divide and conquer strategy going back to the British Empire to keep African countries apart. And look at what was done to Libya. because of Gaddafi's discussion of possibly setting up a monetary fund for Africa backed by gold and oil.
Yeah.
So the idea of independence and sovereignty is what the West is attacking. Now, how do you deal with that? Well, I think this is one of the important things coming from the BRICS, is not the move toward a new financial system yet, because that would be premature, but to replace the control of the dollar and the central banks of Europe with national banking and the use of national currencies in settling trade imbalances, that these can be negotiated from country to country instead of having to go through the International Monetary Fund and the Western banks who have no interest in the development in African countries. I just want to state that I'm firmly of the belief that there's a total difference between the Russian and Chinese approach to Africa now, which is taking into consideration the needs of sovereign nations, as opposed to the continued colonial policies being put forward from the West. One example of that is the European Union coming in and saying to Africa, don't develop your fossil fuels, don't develop nuclear, use solar, go to stick with subsistence agriculture. So they can control the currencies and the exchange rates and the trade balances and so on. So the important thing is that it's not just an assertion of independence, you need new independent institutions. The BRICS Development Bank may be a step in that direction. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is moving towards that. The idea of using national currencies for infrastructure investment. And finally, let me just state, because I'm going to have to be leaving in just a couple minutes, the most important thing is infrastructure. And Elijah mentioned that earlier. The Africans have never been allowed to develop their own infrastructure. They've been there for the colonial exploitation. What we see with the Belt and Road Initiative is the beginnings of a connection, corridors of development connecting North and South African countries, East and West, opening the ports to the landlocked countries, bigger projects like the Trans-Aqua Water Project to replace the shrinking of Lake Chad with cooperative water policies from Congo and elsewhere. The potential for cooperation in Africa is enormous, but you're going to have to kick out the Western advisors and the Western accountants and the financiers who don't give a damn about Africa. And I hate to say it, because some of them are good people when they get there, but they end up working for the corporations and not for the people of Africa. African institutions that work in cooperation by nation is the solution to this, and that's why we need new financial and monetary system and break with this petrodollar colonial system that's prevented Africa from developing.
Thank you so much for your insight, HARLEY SCHLANGER, and of course, very pertinent working for corporations rather than the population, and this is where one of the stakeholders in Nigeria said that Shell should prioritize the civilians rather than corporate interests. Shell is about selling off its business in Nigeria, but what about the implications of its activities on the Niger Delta and the development of the region, which has been put on hold because the nationals don't get to benefit from the endowment of their nations. And it brings us to this question: what is the role of the African leaders? What are their bargaining powers when it comes to negotiating deals that would determine the future of the continent? With to you, Dr. Elijah Enaku, having listened to how countries are redefining their strategies as the world is taking a new turn and things are changing, you begin to ask, when we talk about sovereignty, it's not just about political sovereignty. We also have economic sovereignty, and why not sovereignty in terms of taking strategic decisions that have to do with the minerals on the continent, and now capitalizing still on what I already mentioned earlier on the place of resource, Africa's resource nationalism. You talked about the creation of the Council by the African Union, Commodity Council by the African Union, to see how they can maybe chart the interest of the continent. But now, let's, in terms of minerals protection and being seduced in the 21st century by many countries, how can we redefine a strong resource nationalism policy to ensure that the African continent stand in one accord when negotiating and even set the price for these resources that they owned?
Okay, Clarice, let me be very clear and let me give you 4 concrete steps that the African economies and African countries need to take. And Haley mentioned a couple of them, and Yulia also mentioned a couple of them. And if you listen to my speech in the BRICS Forum, I was really hard on the BRICS member states because I do not expect them to use European policies to deal with Africa. I expect them to be different. Russia's a little bit different, but China not. I think Yulia also mentioned a couple of things that that's going on there. So that was part of my speech when I presented in the BRICS Forum. Now, here is the point I want to make. Number 1, Africa is being killed at the level of financial transaction. Africa does not have a coherent monetary policy. Ask yourself this question. How is it possible that these Western powers do not produce gold? Because the currency of a country is backed by gold reserves. How is it possible that these Western countries do not produce gold? Africa produces gold, but their currency is backed by gold. But most of the African currencies do not have enough gold reserve to support those currencies. That's why you have those fluctuations and those exchange rate very, very high. How is it possible? We do not have a good monetary policy. Now, the second part of the monetary policy is that the monetary policies that you find in Africa are colonial. It's not just the franc CFA, because a lot of people are just going to go to franc CFA. That's the worst of the worst, but there are still others. What are you talking about? The kwacha, you talk about the Kenyan shillings. If you look at the way those currencies are pegged, they still have colonial vestiges attached to those currencies. So we do not have an independent monetary policy in Africa. Number 3, if you look at the loans that African countries collect, for example, because we are talking about minerals and so on, because you need money and so on and so forth. If you look at how these African countries go into partnership with these powers that come into negotiate and extract minerals in Africa, how they're being paid. They're not paid in local African currency. They're paid in dollars. What happens when you get paid in dollars? Who benefits? It's not the African economy. It's those Western powers, the United States and all the others, because of the differences in exchange rate.
Yeah,
so there are lots of policies that happen that Africans need to make sure that they understand what's going on. Even in the financial system, Haley already mentioned about it. If you look at the financial system, African countries go to borrow money on the World Bank at 10, 15%. The Western powers go to borrow money at 0.5%. I expect the BRICS countries to put pressure on these Western powers to make sure that they are considering loans with the country. Because when you have reconsidering loans, they do not follow the main path of the traditional loans that African countries are taking, because they use the credit system and say African countries are a higher risk, therefore we're going to give them loans on a higher rate because of that rate of this, rate of that. I don't want to go into technicalities, but
sure.
I expect the BRICS countries to now put pressure and say African countries cannot be bearing the loan, because if you look in at the debt servicing, Paris, you look at how much the money that's gotten even from the mineral, the stuff or whatnot, is being used to service debt. It's not even used for the economy of those countries' investment. They're being used to service debt. Look at the debt ratio all across Africa. You're dealing with 35% here, 40% here, 50% here. These are put upon the African Union through this institutionalized colonialism, IMF, World Bank, or whatnot. I expect the BRICS Bank to come in and salvage these African countries. So there are a lot of strategies that African can use that you already mentioned one of them, like, on-site production of those minerals. I don't expect Russia, which is a member of the BRICS, to do what the Western world is doing to Africa. I expect that when minerals are extracted from Africa, there should be on-site transformation. That's part of the commodity strategy that the African Union is trying to adopt. They should on-site transformation so that the benefit of that transformation accrue to the local economies and not to the Chinese economy. That is my beef with the Chinese system of working with Africa and utilizing Western colonial systems and saying that they are part of the BRICS. I don't agree with that. So there are lots of things that can happen in Africa. Time will fail us to go through some of this, but there need to be a common strategy among the African countries. There needs to be unity among the African countries to deal with these Western powers. Otherwise, even when they come in to do this, they are going to decimate the economy while extracting minerals.
Indeed, and those are the complexities of the situation surrounding Africa now. You quite mentioned the China and its foreign policy stance in Africa. And if all the activities are happening across the continent, not benefiting Africa, then there is a problem, especially a country that is young and buoyant in terms of human capital. And how can this human capital be harnessed and fight ills like corruption, unemployment, countries more determined than ever before because of the pressing needs of their citizens, and African nations need to be conversant, and being conversant means they have to create a favorable agenda or umbrella that will harbor all the extraction industries or the decisions taken by countries regarding the place and the value of the minerals on the continent. Coming back to you, dear Yulia, now when we're looking at Africa here, we look at the stakeholders or other actors that are coming in. U.S. President Joe Biden has been very intentional lately about trying to win back Africa. Africa wasn't really a friend under the current President Donald Trump, but you saw U.S. Biden trying to win Africa and bringing in the position of the minerals. Now, Russia being part of the BRICS plus nations and others, how can we or the BRICS address some of these foreign policies of countries like China? People have been complaining because China brings in labor and everything goes back to the People's Republic of China, and now it's time to change the narratives. How can the BRICS come in here to help redefine some of the policies, foreign policies of member states in dealing with Africa in terms of investment, and also now another question is, in your own perspective, do you think or what is the possibility of Africa having a single mineral market? We know that countries that export petroleum function under one umbrella. What is the feasibility of creating an organization or a platform for countries having minerals in Africa to be able to sell as a group and make decisions as a group, and with the help of new partners in a multipolar world that seeks to maybe see everybody benefit from the endowment of the world?
Well, when we talk about the United States and its foreign policy and its current dominance, I think it's important to mention that it's based on monopoly that they have in the media, which means that they control the media resources, which allows them to shape public opinion. And when I say media resources, I do not just mean the media outlets or television or this kind of things, but I also mean the Hollywood industry, let's say so, because the cultural expansion and the ideas that are being put into the movies that are popular worldwide, they're also designed in a way in which they're shaping people's opinion and public opinion in general. That's number one. Number two is that the United States have or used to enjoy and are still enjoying some kind of a monopoly on the use of military force without consent or approval of anyone else. So that allows them to deal the hard way, or the hardcore way, I would say, with the situations they don't like, and moreover, to change governments like this, overthrow governments like this, like it happened in Libya, for example. And also, it allows them to make a lot of money on the military-industrial complex. In some cases, it allows them to trade blood for oil. And in most of the cases, we're talking about blood and oil belonging to the people on a certain land. That's happening in Syria. That was happening in many other countries where they were killing the local population and extracting mineral resources, including oil, or oil in particular. That's number two. Number three is that the United States enjoys the full control of the global economy, global economic system, and the petrodollar system. That implies that whatever happens and whoever tries to, trade using their local currencies and whatsoever else, the way the global economy is designed, and let's say the financial system is such that you will always, sooner or later, come to petrodollar, and there is nothing you can do about it at the moment. So even if you say that you trade directly in the Chinese yuan and Russian ruble, still to do the exchange, you still do it through an exchange into US dollars. So there is no way to avoid this at the moment. And those are the three pillars, I would say, on which the hegemony stands.
Yeah.
Also, we need to understand that using those control mechanisms, the US does not always operate directly, as it has a lot of associates and affiliates, and has a vast control over many other countries. So we can hardly talk about France's sovereignty at the moment. We can hardly talk about Germany's sovereignty, because Germany was one of the strongest economies in Europe. That was based on their mighty industrial complex and production, which is now gone, as when they lost access to Russian cheap gas, and when Nord Stream 2 was exploded. A lot of their production had to move to the States, and then the States promised them to cover their needs in terms of energy, but that never happened. And the myth on the renewables is just a myth, because it can never ensure the needs, not of households, but the needs of industries. And there is no example of when and where it could take place. Even in Denmark and even in Germany, where they have the biggest, let's say, wind energy farms, they're located in the Baltic Sea at the north, and the industrial regions are in the south, like Bavaria and other ones. So we see that Germany is weak, extremely weak at the moment. France is controlled, and those were the strongest players on the map of Europe, right? That are not sovereign anymore. So in some cases, the US doesn't even need to act directly, but it can use those puppets that they control. And when we talk about what Africa can do, or what African leaders and countries can do in order to be stronger and obtain more sovereignty, let's take a look at simple facts. So Africa is extremely rich in gold, which is, like the benchmark metal. And it's needed in many different areas. It used to be It used to be the reference point of the economy, and I don't need to, I think, explain why gold is important. Yet at the same time, in Africa, you do not even find refineries that are able to put their label on them, right? So when you produce gold in Africa, of course you can do the gold bars, but then you still have to send them to Dubai in order for them to be sold at the global market, right? So Africa cannot sell it directly, so it does not have the right to claim its gold at the global market, and it doesn't trade at the London Stock Exchange. This is ridiculous. This is extremely unfair when you look at it,
Yeah.
because whatever gold you mine in Africa, then you have to take it somewhere else to legalize it. So the countries do not have the right to say, okay, I put my stamp on it, I guarantee the quality. This is our gold. We trade it at this price. There is no such a right. And I think this is extremely important, not just in this industry, but lately we're seeing more and more news and more, at least of political statements being made, not just by the countries in the western and central regions of Africa, which is Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, that have just had, revolutions for sovereignty, as I would call them, but also in the southern parts of the continent. You have Zimbabwe, and you have other countries that refuse to be a part of that. Let's say, well, they call it global, but it's actually Western system that controls their mining capacities and their opportunities to enter the free trade at the global market. So we will see how this unfolds, but the public steps were made. Some of the documents were signed, and once Africa has the sovereignty to, or African countries, when they claim sovereignty to set the price, to put their stamp on whatever they produce and to dictate the rules of the game, then we will see major changes. But it is necessary to stay united, and united Africa, like actually united Africa, really united Africa, is one of the key threats for that unipolar model, because the West is interested in suppressed and weak Africa that is not able to resist, and that is just spilling blood of neighboring nations and brothers, basically.
Okay, thank you for that brilliant intervention, dear Yulia. Coming back to you, Dr. Elijah Enaku, we are very conversant with the stakes across the African continent, and when you listen all of this, you understand that Africa is still very sidelined when it comes to taking global economic decisions, and for things to change, there is a need to be real and feasible strategies to redefine perspectives. So the question is, now we want to look at the role of the private sector and also the African diaspora in ways that maybe first of all asking if they have the capacity to maybe pressure constructively the international organizations, especially economic organizations that will give Africa a voice on economic affairs, global economic affairs, and also see how the private sector in their quest to ensure also foreign direct investment can help to make sure, like Harley, I underlined earlier on, that they work for the population and not for the corporations.
Clarice, you asked a question that makes me chuckle. When you talk about
Sorry,
the diaspora.
I missed that, Dr. Elijah.
No, I said you asked a question that made me to chuckle. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Thank you. You can go ahead.
Yeah, I said you asked a question that made me to chuckle, because when you talk about our African diaspora, can help in some of these challenges when it comes to mineral strategy in Africa. The question that comes to mind is how many African presidents or how many African governments look at the diaspora as part of a solution instead of a problem? When we are being considered like we're a threat because you want to make sure that there's good governance, you're fighting against corruption, you're fighting against embezzlement, you talk about those things, you're being considered as a threat to your own country. So that's one of the biggest problems we have in Africa, leadership problems. You now talk about sovereignty. The sovereignty in Africa, the deficit of sovereignty in Africa is because of the leaders that we have. We have puppet leaders in Africa. We do not have leaders. So we have leaders in Africa that we have the current leader in Mali, current leader in Burkina Faso and Niger. Then you can say that we have leaders who can stand toe to toe, leaders who welcome their diaspora. Look at what's happening in Niger, the fastest growing country in the world today. What is it? It will shock you to know that's Niger. Go and look at the United Nations Development Index. Yes, Niger is the fastest growing country in the world as we speak today. That's the recent data that I was looking at just recently. It would take a revolution in Africa to have the crop of leadership that is going to stand toe to toe with the West and say, you know what? We are not going to be selling our uranium at 8 euro per kilogram when in the world market is $89.5 per kilogram. We're not going to be doing that. It was going to take a new cream of leadership in Africa to stand toe to toe and say, we are not going to export any gold in this country without being processed either into semi-finished product or finished product. It will take a new cream of leaders to stand and say, no, we are not going to be paid in dollars. We're going to be paid in a local currency. If you come to this country to export, if our currency is, shillings, for example, in Ghana, or shillings in Kenya, we're going to say, you are going to pay us in shillings. We are not going to accept any payment in dollars. We're not going to accept any payment in euro. It's going to take a new cream of leaders to stand toe to toe and say, no, we are not going to have a foreign currency imposed on us. We are going to have our own independent policy. And the diaspora need to be part of this. Look at countries like Ghana, because you mentioned the diaspora, that's why I bring this perspective. Look at countries of Ghana, how they're gradually evolving. They welcome the diaspora, they give an opportunity for the diaspora to come in and bring technology and innovation and everything and be part of the political system. And you have people in government that were in the diaspora that have been co-opted into the economy right now, and they're doing marvelous things. When I finished my postgraduate, one of my colleagues was Ghanaian. While I was trying to, situate myself in terms of what I'm going to do here, he took off his bag and went back to Ghana. As I speak with him now, he has a company, a private initiative that he has started in Ghana. He's working now with the partners that are here, and they are working hand in hand. And that is how the economy is being developed. Absolutely. But you have countries in Africa that are so hostile to the diaspora. How do you expect the diaspora to work hand in hand with them? They see diaspora as the enemy, as the one that is, talking about them or saying something, corruption or whatnot. But that is how Africa is going to develop. As long as we do not welcome our diaspora, because whether you talk about the United States, you talk about which other country in the world, the diaspora has been part and parcel of that development process. So I'm hoping that with the current cream of leadership that we're having in Africa, to answer your question, the diaspora is the part of it. But as so far, what I see happening in Africa, the diaspora is not yet part of the development process that's going on in Africa. It's unfortunate, but that's the truth.
And indeed, a diaspora represents a pool of talent for the African continent, and they can be used with their expertise and know-how to help to redefine perspectives across the African continent. We are almost rounding off, but then coming back to you, dear Yulia, Dr. Elijah, while talking, highlighted a principal aspect which many have even talked about: leadership lapses across the African continent. continent. I quite remember in our interactions with you in Russia, you said about the fact that Russians have understood the stakes, and that is why they have rallied behind their president. And I bet that even the engagement we had with foreigners based in Russia held the same opinion about the fact that Russians love their president. Now we are looking at the way forward with the leadership of Russia that has understood the stakes around the global world, which is primarily to protect the sovereignty of a nation at every front. And we also know that the Russia-Africa relations has taken another dimension, and we can see how this relation has made even other countries to wanting to engage with Africa. You see Ukraine and others opening embassies across the African continent. So now, what will Russia, because like Dr. Enaku highlighted, like people are waiting to see that, okay, you sent away France and embraced Russia, and the country is doing the same. Africa has not changed in terms of development. So how can engaging with African countries, like Russia engaging with African countries, help to bring in those qualities or leadership strategies of a president like Vladimir Putin that will help countries and even Africans understand the narratives and defend the sovereignty of their continent at every front?
Well, talking about the situation in Russia, well, our president, Vladimir Putin, has been enjoying vast support
Please,
of the
you're muted,
population
please.
for
Yeah.
many years by now. And it is proven by various polls, and it is proven at the elections when people come to the polling stations and cast their vote for him, right? At the same time, the country is at war. Russia is at war, and it's not just war for something, it's a war for sovereignty, and moreover, it's a war for existence. What it means is that the country is consolidated. The ones that did not agree with the policy radically, they have left the country. Some of them have come back after having rethought the situation or after not having settled in their new destinations. So there was some kind of an outflow, but then around, well, at least a third of those people who left, they came back. Of course, there are people that are just waiting for it to be over. Well, I would say everyone wants it to be over as soon as possible, but some people do not have a solid position. They choose just not to be in politics. But as for the majority of the population, they are we are very united, very consolidated, because it's a war for existence, and many people are directly involved, either themselves or their family members, their friends are involved into the processes. So it means that the internal issues are put aside for the moment, because like when you're in a fight, first you win, first you achieve the victory, and then you go into analysis of who was doing what and whatever. So war is not the time for internal disputes, for sure. Absolutely. War is when you get consolidated, like you put the different fingers into the fist and you go and fight. So this is what's happening in the country, and I think it sets an example. And this is something that not everyone understands. I mean, our economy has changed. Our economy is focused on the military-industrial complex. We have to be changing a lot of things regarding even the lifestyle, because the country is at war for existence, period. So this is what's happening. I think it does set an example of, a country that didn't drop down on its knees in front of the enemy that is bigger in terms of, the resources, in terms of control and whatever. And I think the current rise of Pan-Africanism and anti-colonial movement sentiment is also somehow related to this example that Russia is setting. So the sentiment of that, you know, the fight is possible and it might be possible to resist and highly likely even to win in this fight. It's important. But when we talk about the countries of the so-called global south, when we talk about South America, Africa, Asia, Russia, we all have resources. So our economies are based on real value and they are more durable. So if this is an exhaustion war, then we have high chances to survive longer, right? Because, well, the people that were living maybe in worse conditions, they're more capable of surviving, and you know, we have the resources and ability to use them, which makes us quite durable in this exhaustion confrontation, I would say. But we will see how this unfolds, and of course it will take time. When we talk about African leaders, and not just African leaders, but the way the global elite was functioning is that you know, they were making sure that they have different triggers and different strings they can pull in order to manipulate the you know, the leaders. So to dismantle the system, of course, processes would have to be launched, and it would take time. And unfortunately, there is probably no way to speed it up because, you know, like they say, if it takes 9 months for one pregnant woman to, you know, to have the baby and to get the baby delivered, if you take 9 pregnant women, it doesn't mean that they would be able to do it in 1 month, right?
Absolutely.
So some processes just do take time. So let's see how this unfolds. But it looks like what survives is what is based on strategic values, resources, and the ability to have, you know, the will and the power to combine the two and just, you know, live on.
It's about the willpower. It's about the intentions. 1 minute with you concluding, Dr. Elijah. How do you think countries in Africa can navigate these challenges that come as across of you know, resource nationalism, geopolitical tensions, and even potential conflicts across the African continent? Just 1 minute, please.
Yeah, Clarice, I think I'm very optimistic. I want to end it on a very optimistic note. I think Africa will get there if the trajectory which Africa is taking right now in terms of some of the countries that are reclaiming their independence, if the trajectory continues and the cream of young people, even those that are going through, I mean, countries that are going through either coup d'etat or democracy like we see in Senegal, or semi-democracy like we see in Gabon or some other countries, if this trajectory continues, I think Africa will get somewhere. So there's hope out there. So I want to end on a hopeful note that the current leaders that we have right now are not doing anything to Africa. But if the trajectory of leadership that is coming up continues this way, I think Africa will get somewhere.
Indeed, it's a gradual process. I wish to thank you immensely, Dr. Elijah Enaku, YULIA BERG, and HARLEY SCHLANGER for the great insight on our topic for discussion this day. It's about intentional leadership. It's about redefining Africa's commercial policy and also redefining Africa's foreign policies and understanding international politics to be able to shape narratives in Africa, especially at a time of increased multilateralism. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for trusting the Pan-African television, and also immense thanks goes to the technical crew for ensuring that the program was a success. I'll keep you in the company of programs on For You Media. Always remember, it's another view of the world. See you some other time.